In 900 CE, Baghdad's treasury collected 400 million silver dirhams in a single year. The figure comes from al-Qudama ibn Ja'far's Kitab al-Kharaj, a 10th century tax manual written by a senior Abbasid revenue official. It is not legend, it is a government record. The entire Carolingian Empire of Charlemagne, the dominant Western power of his era, accumulated roughly 2 million pounds of silver across his full 46-year reign. You are not comparing a rich city to a poor one. You are comparing two fundamentally different categories of civilization. The mechanism behind the gap is documented, traceable to primary sources, and more applicable to your present economic situation than anything in a standard history curriculum. This is noob historian. Every war, every empire, every revolution has a price tag. We find it. In 762 CE, Caliph al-Mansur founded Baghdad on the western bank of the Tigris River. He did not choose the site arbitrarily. Contemporary sources, including al-Tabari's Tariq al-Rasul wal-Muluk, record al-Mansur personally testing the site's climate across multiple seasons before committing to construction. He sent engineers to study flood patterns. He surveyed soil drainage. He measured prevailing winds. The founding of Baghdad was an engineering project before it was a political one. The city al-Mansur built was circular, not as an aesthetic statement, as administrative and military logic. The round city placed the caliph's palace and the grand mosque at the geographic center, with government offices radiating outward in concentric rings and four roads extending toward the four cardinal points of the empire. Revenue flowed inward, orders flowed outward. The geometry encoded the economic function. Al-Khatib al-Baghdadi's Tariq Baghdad, a 14-volume urban history completed in 1071 CE, documented the city at its peak with a level of detail modern historians continue to rely on. He recorded commercial districts organized by trade type. He mapped the location and number of paper markets. He described the bookseller quarters, the canal network feeding the city's freshwater supply, and the population density of individual neighborhoods. His work functions as a comprehensive economic geography of the medieval world's most productive city. His population estimates, cross-referenced against archaeological data by Tertius Chandler in 4,000 Years of Urban Growth, St. David's University Press, 1987, placed Baghdad between 500,000 and 1 million residents by 900 CE. Chandler's Global Urban Reconstruction ranks Baghdad as the world's largest city from approximately 775 CE to 935 CE, placing it above Constantinople, Chang'an, and Rome simultaneously, the largest city on Earth, by documented population counts, in the 9th century, in a desert environment, without oil, without industrialization, without modern agricultural technology. The mechanism sustaining 1 million people in Mesopotamia in the 9th century is the economic story this video documents. It does not begin with conquest. By the time Baghdad reached its population peak, the Abbasid military frontier had been largely stable for generations. The surplus generating 1 million urban residents was coming from within, from productive capacity, from compounding returns on a specific set of policy decisions made by al-Mansur's grandson. Caliph Harun al-Rashid, ruling from 786 to 809 CE, established the formal institution later documented as Bait al-Hikmah, the House of Wisdom. His son, al-Ma'mun, expanded it into a full state institution between 813 and 833 CE. Ibn al-Nadim's Firist, a bibliographic catalog written in 987 CE, documents what the institution produced. Over 10,000 translated and original works commissioned, cataloged, and stored under Abbasid state patronage. 10,000 documents. Under state commission. In the 9th century, not in a university, not in a private library, in a government institution funded by the imperial treasury. Al-Kifti's Tariq al-Hukama, compiled around 1227 CE, functions as an HR ledger for the Abbasid knowledge operation. It records scholars by name, lists their specializations, documents their salaries, and describes their institutional affiliations. Mathematicians, astronomers, physicians, agronomists, translators, and geographers all received wages from the imperial payroll. The Tariq al-Hukama is not a celebration of great minds. It is a personnel file. These were not volunteers. They were salaried state employees. The Abbasid Caliphate built a paid intellectual workforce and funded it from public revenue. The question historians spent decades examining was whether this represented cultural patronage, the collection of thinkers as prestige goods by wealthy rulers, or state investment with measurable economic returns. The evidence from tax records, agricultural surveys, and trade documentation now points toward the latter. The Abbasid state funded knowledge production because knowledge production increased taxable output. The chain from scholarship to revenue is traceable through primary documents. The dirham is the first piece of external evidence. The Abbasid silver dirham, minted from 696 CE and continuing through the full Abbasid period to 1258 CE, maintained documented weight and purity standards across 5 centuries. Michael Bates's Islamic Coins, published by the American Numismatic Society, and the British Museum's Islamic coin database traced dirham distribution through archaeological recovery across sites from Scandinavia to West Africa to Central Asia. A coin found in a Viking burial hoard in Sweden, in a merchant cache in East Africa, and in a bazaar in Samarkand is not decorative evidence. It is proof of monetary reach. Merchants across the medieval world held dirhams because the economy they represented generated consistent surpluses and maintained currency reliability across 5 centuries. The dirham's global circulation reflected an economy generating genuine surplus. And the source of the surplus was not conquest, it was productivity. Compounding returns on knowledge investment. To follow those returns, you trace the money through 3 separate documented channels: the translation program, the paper economy, and the agricultural diffusion network. Each one feeds the next. Caliph al-Ma'mun made the most consequential single policy decision in the economic history of the medieval world between 813 and 833 CE. The policy is documented in Ibn al-Nadim's Fihrist. What al-Ma'mun did was simple and specific. He began paying translators the weight of their completed manuscripts in gold, not by the page, not by the hour, by the weight of the finished work in gold. This was incentive design, not generosity. Al-Ma'mun had evidence drawn from the preceding generation of Abbasid administration, showing applied Greek and Persian scientific knowledge generating measurable improvements in agricultural yields, medical practice, and navigational accuracy. He priced the output of knowledge production at a premium because his administration had already observed the returns. He scaled the investment accordingly. The single most productive scholar under this payment system was Hunayn ibn Ishaq, a Nestorian Christian physician who worked under Abbasid patronage from approximately 830 to 870 CE. Al-Kifti's records in the Tarikh al-Hukama document Hunayn, translating over 116 Greek medical texts into Arabic and Syriac, including the complete works of Galen, a single scholar, 40 years. 116 clinical texts moving from Greek into the language of the world's largest economy. To follow the economic return on Hunayn's translations, you trace the downstream effects through 3 documented layers of the medical system. First layer, the clinical knowledge base. Galen's medical framework, once translated and distributed in Arabic, restructured clinical practice across the caliphate. Al-Razi, the Iranian physician based in Baghdad from approximately 860 to 925 CE, wrote the Hawi, a 25-volume encyclopedic synthesis of Greek, Persian, and Indian medical knowledge, informed directly by the translated Galenic corpus. The Hawi became the primary clinical reference text for hospitals across the Abbasid world. Second layer, the hospital system. The Abbasid Bimaristan network, the hospital system sustained by state and charitable endowment, operated on the medical protocols the translated texts made accessible. Baghdad's Bimaristan, documented in detail by the 12th century traveler Ibn Jubair, employed salaried physicians, maintained pharmaceutical dispensaries, and admitted patients without charge. The Bimaristan model spread across the caliphate. By the 10th century, major Abbasid cities operated hospitals running on standardized clinical protocols derived from translated Greek knowledge. Third layer, the labor force. A salaried physician workforce maintaining population health across a territory larger than the Roman Empire at its peak. The economic return on workforce health is not theoretical. Healthier agricultural and artisan workers produce more output per day of labor. They pay more tax. They sustain higher population density. They generate the surplus al-Qudama's tax manual records. The compounding return on a single medical translation commission runs through every layer of the productive economy across generations. The mathematics translation program operated on identical logic. Al-Khwarizmi, working at the House of Wisdom under al-Ma'mun's direct patronage, synthesized Indian numerical notation with Greek geometric method and produced the Kitab al-Muqtasar fi Hisab al-Jabr wal-Muqabala around 820 CE. The word algebra derives from al-Jabr in his title. His work gave merchants a standardized calculation system applicable to commercial contracts, land measurement, and inheritance division across the caliphate. The Cairo Genizah documents, the 300,000-plus medieval Jewish merchant letters and financial instruments analyzed by S.E.D. Goitin across his 6-volume A Mediterranean Society, University of California Press, 1967 to 1993, show merchants operating across the Abbasid world using standardized numerical accounting methods consistent with al-Khwarizmi's system by the 10th century. Traders in Cairo, Alexandria, and Aden worked from the same arithmetic framework, translated and distributed from Baghdad. A merchant in Morocco and a merchant in Samarkand ran the same calculations on the same commercial contracts using a shared mathematical language produced by a state-funded scholar in 820 CE. Standardized commercial mathematics reduces transaction costs. It reduces accounting errors. It enables complex multi-party contracts at distances where verification of calculations was otherwise impossible. The economic value of a shared mathematical standard across a trade network spanning Morocco to Central Asia is measurable in the reduced friction of every transaction conducted using it across 2 centuries of commercial operation. Al-Mamun was not funding scholars for cultural prestige. He was funding scholars because their outputs reduced economic friction and increased productive capacity at scale. His payment system was the world's first documented state research and development budget, designed to attract the best available intellectual talent and maximize the output of applied knowledge production. The OECD's Science, Technology, and Innovation Outlook 2023 measures the return on modern state R&D investment at 2.5 to 5 times GDP over 20-year periods. Al-Mamun arrived at the same conclusion empirically in 830 CE. His method was observation of tax returns rather than econometric regression. The finding was the same. What separated Al-Mamun's program from prior patronage systems was scale, payment structure, and institutional continuity. Earlier caliphs had funded individual scholars. Al-Mamun funded an institution with a salaried workforce, a documented methodology, a priority list of texts to translate, and a distribution mechanism for the outputs. The House of Wisdom under Al-Mamun was a government research institution, not a royal library. The distinction matters for the economic analysis. Royal libraries produce prestige. Government research institutions produce applicable outputs with measurable downstream returns. The Abbasid distinction between these 2 functions is documented in the different administrative structures used for each. The House of Wisdom had a budget line in the Divan al-Kharaj. The Royal Library did not. In 794 CE, the first paper mill in the Islamic world opened in Baghdad. Al-Tabari's Tarikh al-Rusul wal-Muluk records the event. The papermaking technology arrived from Tang, China, transferred westward along trade corridors following the Battle of Talas in 751 CE, during which Abbasid forces captured Chinese papermakers among other skilled craftsmen and brought them to Mesopotamia. Cheap paper in the Islamic world changed the economics of knowledge production and distribution in ways Al-Mamun's translation program alone never achieved. Understanding the paper economy requires understanding what knowledge distribution cost before it existed. Before paper, administrative records, commercial contracts, and scholarly texts existed on papyrus or parchment. Papyrus was expensive to import from Egypt, fragile in the dry Mesopotamian climate, and difficult to fold and bind for extended documents. Parchment required animal skins, specialized preparation, and significant material cost per page. Both materials limited knowledge distribution by making reproduction prohibitively expensive for any audience outside wealthy patrons or state institutions. A medical text stayed in Baghdad because copying it for distribution to Basra cost more than most practitioners earned in a month. Paper reduced the cost of reproduction by an order of magnitude. A scholar producing a copy of a medical text in 9th century Baghdad on paper spent a fraction of the time and materials required for parchment. The book trade became economically viable for a commercial market rather than exclusively for wealthy individual commissioners. Al-Khatib al-Baghdadi's Tarikh Baghdad describes the Warrakan district of Baghdad in precise detail. The Warrakan were the paper merchants and booksellers of the city, operating a commercial district documented as one of the most active commercial zones in the urban geography. He records booksellers functioning simultaneously as publishers, copyists, literary agents, and retailers. They commissioned works from scholars, paid copyists to reproduce existing texts, sold directly to merchants and administrators, and maintained stock for walk-in buyers. The book trade was an industry with a supply chain, from the paper mills, through copyist workshops, through bookseller storefronts, to commercial buyers. The Warrakan district housed the distribution system of the Abbasid knowledge economy. What the Warrakan district represents economically is information infrastructure. The same economic function performed today by internet service providers, cloud storage systems, and publishing platforms was performed in 9th century Baghdad by a commercial ecosystem operating on cheap paper. The parallel is not decorative, it is structural. Remove the Warrakan network and the House of Wisdom's outputs stay inside the institution. With the Warrakan network distributing outputs commercially across the empire, returns on a single scholarly investment accumulate at every point of application across a territory stretching from Morocco to the borders of Tang, China. Cheap paper enabled 2 distinct economic mechanisms with documented returns. The first was standardized commercial documentation. The sack system, from the Arabic root from which the English word check derives, became standardized across the Abbasid commercial network in the 9th and 10th centuries. A merchant in Baghdad wrote a credit instrument payable in Cairo or Samarkand. The receiving merchant presented the sack to a corresponding agent in his city and collected payment in local currency. The physical silver never moved across dangerous overland routes. The documented obligation moved instead on paper through a trusted network of corresponding agents. The Cairo Janaza documents show these instruments in active use across trade routes spanning from Muslim Spain to the Indian coast. S.D. Goitein's analysis identifies sack-based credit instruments as a primary mechanism enabling long-distance trade without physical coin transport. The standardized credit instrument, made economically viable by cheap paper, reduced the transaction cost and physical risk of long-distance commerce across the Abbasid network in ways no prior financial system had achieved at comparable geographic scale. Janet Abu-Lughod's Before European Hegemony, Oxford University Press, 1989, reconstructs the world trade system of the 8th to 13th centuries from archaeological, numismatic, and documentary evidence. She places Baghdad at the apex of a global trade network valued at $10 to $15 billion in purchasing power parity terms. The sack system, enabled by cheap paper and grounded in al-Khwarizmi's standardized arithmetic, was the financial infrastructure of this network. You do not move $10 to $15 billion in purchasing power parity trade without a credit instrument. The Abbasid Caliphate had one. The rest of the medieval world did not. The second mechanism was technical knowledge distribution at geographic scale. Before paper, a physician in Basra seeking access to Galenics, medical knowledge needed either to travel to Baghdad or commission an expensive parchment copy through a specialist intermediary. Both options placed the knowledge out of reach for most practitioners. After the paper economy established the Warkan commercial network, a certified copy of a medical manual reached Basra through the book trade at market prices, accessible to a working physician's income. The same applied to agronomic manuals, navigational texts, and mathematical treatises. Technical knowledge produced in Baghdad became commercially distributable across the empire's full geographic extent. Andrew Watson's Agricultural Innovation in the Early Islamic World, Cambridge University Press, 1983, documents the agricultural outcome of this distribution. A 30 to 40% expansion of cultivated land across the Abbasid world between 700 and 1100 CE, enabled by the diffusion of technical agronomic knowledge through the written literature network built on cheap paper. The paper economy was not a support system for the knowledge economy. The paper economy was the distribution mechanism without which the knowledge investments at the center generated returns only in Baghdad. Paper was the multiplier. The mechanism with the most direct documentary evidence in Abbasid economic history is the one least covered in standard accounts of the Islamic Golden Age. It is the state agricultural diffusion program, and it is documented in tax records, administrative manuals, and contemporary agronomic literature spread across archives from Istanbul to Cambridge. The Abbasid Revenue Ministry, the Divan al-Kharaj, maintained a corps of officials called Sahib al-Misaha, meaning land survey officers. Their function was to measure cultivated land, assess soil quality, document water access, and calculate taxable agricultural output. They traveled the empire's territory, recording productive capacity with the systematic rigor of a government statistical agency. The data they collected flowed to Baghdad. Agricultural officials at the center used it to identify where new crop introductions were feasible, where irrigation investment would expand taxable land, and where existing cultivation performed below the level of comparable regions. They then issued guidance through administrative channels, distributed technical manuals through the Warkan commercial network, and in documented cases funded infrastructure directly. Ibn Wahshiyah's Nabatean agriculture, written around 904 CE, is a surviving product of this system. It synthesizes Mesopotamian agricultural knowledge with contemporary Abbasid practice across 28 topics: soil conditioning, seed selection, irrigation engineering, crop rotation, pest management, and seasonal timing, for specific crops in specific climatic zones. It is not a theoretical text. It is a practitioner's manual produced for administrators and landowners managing agricultural operations under the Abbasid system. The Abbasid state funded its production. The Warkan network distributed it. Local administrators and landowners applied it. The Divan al-Kharaj measured the results in tax receipts. Andrew Watson's reconstruction traces the specific crop transfers documented in this literature across a 4-century period. Sugarcane, requiring specific moisture levels and tropical adjacent temperatures, was introduced from South Asia to Egypt and the Mediterranean coastline during the early Abbasid period. The technical documentation for its cultivation, covering irrigation, specifications, soil preparation requirements, and processing methods, circulated in the agronomic literature before the crop itself reached commercial scale in new territories. The knowledge preceded the crop. The crop followed the knowledge. Cotton moved from its Persian origin base into Egypt, North Africa, and eventually the Iberian Peninsula. Hard wheat varieties adapted to drier growing conditions spread from the Fertile Crescent into North African territories, where only barley had previously been viable. Citrus species moved from South Asian origin into Mediterranean coastal zones. Rice varieties reached Spain from Persia through the documented Abbasid diffusion network. Watson identifies over 50 crops transferred in this manner between 700 and 1100 CE. Each transfer required documented agronomic knowledge, soil preparation requirements, water management specifications, seed sourcing and storage protocols, and processing methods for the harvested product. All of it circulated in written form through the commercial paper network operating outward from Baghdad. Every crop transfer was a knowledge transfer first. The aggregate effect Watson documents from tax records and land survey data is a 30 to 40% expansion of cultivated land across the Abbasid world over 4 centuries, without machinery, without synthetic fertilizer, without modern irrigation technology, through knowledge transfer facilitated by a state-funded institutional infrastructure and distributed through a commercial paper network. Philip Hittie's Analysis and History of the Arabs, Princeton University Press, 1937, draws on al-Qudama's Kitab al-Kharaj to show agricultural tax revenues nearly tripling between the early Abbasid period in the 750s CE and the fiscal peak of the 9th century. Watson's crop diffusion data is the mechanism explaining Hittie's revenue numbers: more cultivated land, producing higher value crops in new geographic markets, generating larger taxable surpluses assessed by the Sahib al-Masaha network and collected by the Divan al-Kharaj. The chain from knowledge investment to tax receipt is fully traceable. You are looking at a government operating a documented feedback loop. Invest in knowledge production, distribute outputs through a commercial network, apply them to agricultural practice, measure the results through a revenue collection bureaucracy, reinvest the returns into further knowledge production. The Abbasid state ran this loop for 5 centuries. The OECD's 2023 R&D multiplier data of 2.5 to 5 times GDP over 20-year periods reflects the same mechanism operating through modern institutional forms. The Abbasid cycle operated on a longer timeline across a larger territory with less measurement precision. The structural logic is identical. The dirham is the financial expression of this system's output. By 900 CE, al-Qudama's records show state revenue at 400 million dirhams annually. Hugh Kennedy's The Prophet and the Age of the Caliphates, Longman 1986, places this figure at roughly 40 to 50% of contemporary Byzantine GDP. 2 empires in the medieval world generated surplus at this scale. The Abbasid surplus derived from knowledge-driven agricultural and commercial productivity. The Byzantine surplus derived from taxation of an older, slower-growing system. The difference in mechanism explains the difference in trajectory. The Abbasid economy grew because its knowledge investment so compounded into higher agricultural output, expanded commercial networks, and a more widely circulated monetary instrument. The Byzantine economy maintained because its system preserved rather than multiplied. The dirham's global circulation, documented in archaeological finds from Sweden to sub-Saharan Africa to Central Asia, is the monetary expression of an economy generating consistent surplus, through a system no other medieval state had built at comparable scale or documented with comparable precision. On February 13, 1258 CE, Hulagu Khan's Mongol forces entered Baghdad following a 2-week siege. What followed is documented in Rashid al-Din's Jami al-Tawarikh, written around 1307 CE by a Persian court historian with documented access to Mongol imperial records. The destruction lasted several weeks. The last Abbasid caliph, al-Mustasim, was executed. The contents of the House of Wisdom were thrown into the Tigris River. Contemporary accounts describe the river running dark with ink. Whether the detail is literal or literary, the institutional destruction is documented across multiple independent sources from the 13th and 14th centuries. What historians debated for decades was whether the Mongol siege caused the Islamic Golden Age's end or accelerated a decline already underway. The evidence from economic data and agricultural surveys now supports a more precise conclusion. The Abbasid economy was contracting before 1258, but the Mongol destruction converted a manageable contraction into a structural, multi-generational catastrophe from which the region did not recover for 700 years. The distinction matters because it identifies the specific mechanisms of irreversibility. Economic contractions recover, capital depletes and rebuilds, populations decline and regenerate, trade routes close and reopen. What does not recover automatically is institutional human capital, concentrated in a single geographic node with no distributed redundancy. The House of Wisdom was not a library. It was an institution with a salaried workforce, a documented methodology, an accumulated curriculum built across 4 centuries, administrative structures for commissioning and distributing outputs, and peer networks connecting specialists across disciplines. When Hulagu Khan's forces destroyed it, they did not destroy books. They destroyed the institutional system within which books had economic application. The books without the institution were raw material without the factory. Al-Safadi's biographical dictionary, Al-Wafi bil-Wafayat, compiled in the 14th century, allows historians to trace individual scholars who fled Baghdad before and during the siege. Some reached Cairo, where the Mamluk Sultanate actively recruited Abbasid refugee scholars and attempted to establish successor institutions. Some went to Anatolia. Some dispersed into Persia. The knowledge they carried enriched those destinations measurably. The Mamluk Cairo institutions absorbed individual scholars with House of Wisdom training. They absorbed the knowledge held in the scholars' memories and in the manuscripts carried out of Baghdad. They did not absorb the administrative system, the peer networks, the accumulated data infrastructure, or the state investment mechanism of the original institution. Individual nodes of the destroyed network reached the periphery. The network itself did not reconstitute. This is what modern economic analysis calls concentration risk, the vulnerability of any productive system whose capacity is centralized in a single location without redundant institutional nodes. The Abbasid knowledge economy had no backup. When the primary institution was destroyed, the compounding mechanism stopped. No peripheral institution had the density to restart it. The second mechanism of irreversibility was physical capital destruction with a multi-century recovery horizon. Robert Maxey Adams' Land Behind Baghdad, University of Chicago Press, 1965, is the foundational archaeological survey of Mesopotamian land use patterns, from antiquity through the medieval period. Adams conducted ground surveys and aerial photography analysis of the Nahrawan Canal system, the primary irrigation infrastructure sustaining the Tigris-Euphrates agricultural zone east of Baghdad. The Nahrawan Canal was not a single channel. It was 800 years of layered hydraulic engineering. Primary canals, secondary distribution branches, regulator weirs, storage basins, and drainage networks feeding an agricultural zone covering thousands of square kilometers. It had been built, maintained, and extended under successive administrations, from Sassanid Persia through the Umayyad and Abbasid periods, 8 centuries of accumulated engineering capital, encoded in the landscape itself. Mongol forces breached the primary canal infrastructure during and after the siege. The consequence, Adams documents through archaeological stratigraphy, is not temporary flooding. It is permanent salinization and siltation of the agricultural zone. When irrigation canals are breached without managed drainage, water tables rise, evaporation increases, and mineral salt deposits accumulate in topsoil at rates exceeding the natural flushing capacity of the soil. The land does not flood and drain. It floods, evaporates, and deposits minerals until the topsoil chemistry no longer supports viable cultivation. Researchers using NASA and USGS Landsat archive data extended Adams's ground survey with satellite imagery comparing the Nahrawan zone's vegetation and soil signatures across time. The agricultural contraction is visible in the satellite record extending through the 20th century. The Nahrawan agricultural zone, productive for 800 years under managed irrigation, did not recover comparable output capacity for 700 years after the canal breach. This is capital destruction with a 700-year depreciation period, not political instability, not drought. Damaged soil chemistry and land, made productive by 8 centuries of engineered hydraulic management, returned to unproductive desert by weeks of deliberate infrastructure destruction. The population data confirms the scale of the economic collapse. Tertius Chandler's 4,000 Years of Urban Growth and J.R. and William H. McNeil's The Human Web, Norton, 2003, both reconstruct Baghdad's population trajectory from medieval documentary sources and archaeological evidence. Estimates at peak range from 1 million to 2 million residents. By 1300 CE, within a single generation of the siege, population counts fall below 50,000, a reduction exceeding 95% within one generation, documented across multiple independent scholarly reconstructions. The knowledge economy, the agricultural surplus, the monetary network, the commercial infrastructure, and the institutional workforce all dissolved within 50 years of the siege, and the global trade routes reorganized around Baghdad's absence. Janet Abu-Lughad's Before European Hegemony shows the post-1258 trade network shifting progressively toward the Red Sea and overland routes through Anatolia and Persia. The Indian Ocean trade, previously anchored to Basra and Baghdad as its western terminus, began routing through Egyptian and East African ports. The commercial geography of the medieval world reorganized around a vacancy where the world's largest economy had been. Abu-Lughad argues this reorganization directly contributed to the conditions enabling European maritime expansion in the 15th century. Vasco da Gama's route around Africa in 1498 was not an act of isolated European ingenuity in an empty world. It was a commercial response to disrupted overland routes, whose disruption traced, at least partially, to the events of 1258. Baghdad's destruction helped create the conditions for the age of discovery. The collapse of the world's most productive knowledge economy reshuffled the entire global trade architecture within 200 years. The receipts for all of it are in the tax records, the archaeological surveys, the biographical dictionaries, and the Mongol imperial chronicles. The Abbasid knowledge economy ended in 1258. Its mechanisms are documented in administrative records, tax manuals, biographical dictionaries, agricultural surveys, numismatic databases, and archaeological site analyses spread across libraries in Cambridge, Oxford, London, and Istanbul. The distance between the 9th century and the 21st century shrinks considerably when you follow the mechanisms rather than the dates. There are 5 documented parallels. Each one is traceable to primary data. None of them requires speculation. The first parallel is concentration risk. The Abbasid system placed its most productive institutional capital in a single city, a single institution, with no distributed redundancy. When the institution was destroyed, the compounding mechanism stopped. The periphery absorbed individual scholars. No successor institution absorbed the system itself. Modern AI development exhibits the same structural vulnerability the Abbasid knowledge economy built. The OECD's Science, Technology and Innovation Outlook 2023 documents the United States and China accounting for roughly 60% of global AI research output. The frontier model development pipeline, the training infrastructure, the evaluation methodology, and the deployment ecosystem are concentrated in a small number of companies operating in a small number of cities. Modern economies invest heavily in distributed redundancy for data storage, power grids, and supply chains, precisely because concentration risk is understood and feared in those domains. The same redundancy logic does not yet govern the institutional concentration of AI research capability in a handful of corporate laboratories in San Francisco, Seattle, and Beijing. When the House of Wisdom burned, there was no backup. The scholars who survived carried individual fragments of institutional knowledge in their memories. No one carried the institution. The modern equivalent question is not hypothetical. It is an engineering and policy decision being made right now. The second parallel is the brain drain mechanism. After 1258, surviving scholars dispersed to Cairo, Anatolia, and Persia. The Mamluk Cairo court benefited measurably from Abbasid refugee scholars, enriching its institutions. The periphery gained human capital the core no longer sustained. The knowledge was not destroyed in total. It was redistributed in a pattern enriching receiving economies at the expense of the origin economy's long-term productive capacity. The World Bank's 2023 Migration and Development Brief documents Iraq, Syria, and Afghanistan losing between 30 and 40% of their university-educated populations since 2003. The mechanism is structurally identical to the post-1258 scholar diaspora, absent the physical siege. Conflict, institutional collapse, and economic contraction drive human capital outward from the region where it was formed. The receiving economies gain knowledge workers produced at others' expense. Frederick Docquier and Hillel Rappaport's research on brain drain economics, published in the Journal of Economic Literature, documents the negative multiplier effects on origin economies: reduced tax base, reduced institutional density, slower knowledge accumulation in the depleted environment. Baghdad in 1300 CE and Baghdad in 2023 share a mechanism across a 700-year interval. The geography is the same, the economic pattern is the same. The documentary evidence for both periods exists and is accessible. The third parallel is the state R&D investment question. Al-Mamun's translation payment system was a government program. The House of Wisdom was a government institution. The Sahib al-Misaha Agricultural Survey Network was a government bureaucracy. The dirham mint was a government operation. The returns on all 4 flowed back into state revenue, which funded further investment. The OECD's measured R&D multipliers of 2.5 to 5 times GDP over 20-year periods confirm the Abbasid empirical finding with modern measurement tools. State investment in knowledge production generates returns exceeding the investment cost. Al-Mamun's caliphate discovered this through observation of tax receipts between 750 and 850 CE. The OECD confirmed it through econometric regression in 2023. The finding is the same. The contemporary policy debate is not about whether state-funded R&D generates returns. The evidence on this question is settled by both historical documentation and modern measurement. The debate concerns institutional form. The Abbasid model concentrated investment in a single institution in a single city. The modern alternative is distributed institutional networks with standardized knowledge-sharing protocols. The Abbasid experience suggests the distributed model is more resilient, even where it is less efficient in the short term. An institution destroyed in one city does not end the program if equivalent institutions exist in 20 cities. The fourth parallel is the translation economy. Al-Mansur paid translators in gold because translated knowledge generated returns exceeding the commission cost. A Greek medical text translated into Arabic unlocked pharmaceutical, agricultural, and navigational applications across a territory of 10 million square kilometers. The cost of translation was a fraction of the downstream return on the knowledge it transferred. The global translation and localization market is projected at $98 billion by 2027, according to Common Sense Advisory's industry data. The economic logic is identical to Al-Mamun's calculation. Knowledge produced in one language generates returns in other linguistic markets only after translation and localization. The cost of translation is consistently lower than the value of knowledge access it transfers. The open source software movement operates on the same principle. Code documented and published under an open license generates returns for users across languages and geographies whose aggregate value exceeds what the original developer captured. Wikipedia, the Archive preprint server, and Creative Commons licensing are 21st century implementations of the economic logic the Abbasid state discovered in the 9th century. Subsidizing knowledge, distribution generates aggregate returns exceeding the subsidy cost. Al-Mamun figured this out empirically. Modern open access advocates are rediscovering it institutionally. The fifth parallel is the hardest one to examine directly. The Nahrawan Canal system required 800 years of accumulated engineering investment to build. It was severed in weeks. The agricultural productivity it sustained did not recover for 700 years. The destruction targeted physical infrastructure so integrated into the productive capacity of the land itself. Removing it eliminated the land's ability to sustain civilization at the density the economy required. The World Bank's Changing Wealth of Nations 2021 report documents the economics of natural capital depletion in terms structurally identical to the Nahrawan case. Aquifers depleted beyond recharge rates, topsoil structures degraded past regeneration thresholds, and reef systems bleached past recovery capacity all represent physical capital built over geological timescales, sustaining agricultural and economic productivity at the margins. Their depletion follows the same irreversibility pattern Adams documents in the Nahrawan archaeological data. Physical capital below a threshold productivity level does not regenerate on economic timescales. The Abbasid case is not a warning about knowledge economies specifically. It is the only large-scale historical experiment with a controlled before and after dataset on what happens when the physical substrate of an economy is destroyed faster than it rebuilds. The result lasted 700 years. The receipts are in the satellite imagery. The Abbasid knowledge economy was not an accident of geography or religion or cultural genius. It was a policy outcome. The caliph decided to fund scholars and pay them by the weight of their manuscripts in gold. The scholars produced knowledge. The knowledge increased agricultural yields, improved navigational accuracy, standardized commercial mathematics, and extended the reach of state administration across the world's largest economy. The returns compounded for 5 centuries, and then a single event destroyed the institutional node with no redundant backup, severed the physical infrastructure with a 700-year recovery horizon, and dispersed the human capital across a periphery too fragmented to reconstitute the system. The receipts for all of it exist in tax manuals written in 928 CE, in merchant letters stored in a Cairo synagogue for 1,000 years, in coin weight records from a 9th century mintmaster, in soil salinity measurements derived from satellite imagery of a canal network breached in 1258. Every claim in this video traces to a document. Every number traces to a record. The story they tell is not about a golden age. It is about a working system, its mechanisms, its returns, and its failure mode. The failure mode is still running. Noob historian. Every war, every empire, every revolution has a price tag. We find it.